Good afternoon, Eugene. How are you?
I'm great, Jana. How are you today?
Great, excellent. So we've had a lot of parents in our network. We have over 100,000 now in our networks across all of our channels and our subscribers. So it's growing the number of parents that are concerned about what's in the child's classroom. And a lot of parents have opted their children out of the SPHE courses and the RSE. But if you've had a chance to just watch our recent podcast showing the cross-curricular approach and louder than words, this indoctrination is across all subjects. Louder than words is an English book. So I guess more than it contradicting the parents, the moral conscience, more than it dumbing kids down and indoctrinating them, there's also another layer to the damage that the Irish school curriculum and really the curriculum across the West is doing to children. So, Eugene, I know you've read this book. I'll turn it over to you to talk about this book that you've read, which is quite alarming, and parents can see the real damage to the child's brain that this is causing. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about the book.
We haven't really done many book reviews. We probably need to do a few, actually. This is one, The Indoctrinated Brain by Michael Nehls. He's a medical doctor and also a PhD. So it's a guy who kind of knows what he's talking about. And I guess the kind of the tagline that he has for the book is how to successfully fend off the global attack on your mental freedom. And we'll get to why he has that as his tagline on the book. So this is, I think it came out in 2024. It's a relatively recent book, and we'll kind of go through an overview of the table of contents, but it covers a few things. It covers the process of indoctrination. It talks about how the brain functions. It talks about the things that can damage the brain and hence lead to things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And the effects of things like trauma, etc., and how that can actually can facilitate indoctrination and essentially creating people that are, I don't like to use the term zombie, but kind of zombie-like in that they would be inflexible, unwilling to accept any alternative view of the world apart from the narrative that they've been indoctrinated with, that kind of thing, right? And it talks about some of the health aspects to improve your mental health as well, and to offset the risk of dementia and Alzheimer's and indoctrination as well. So they're all part of it. So it's actually a very useful book on multiple fronts, even if you weren't interested maybe on the indoctrination side. So it's a little bit on the author himself. He's German, say physician and a researcher, and he's done a lot of work in terms of looking into the whole area of Alzheimer's and dementia. And I guess that's kind of where he's coming from. So he's looking at the processes in the brain that lead to that and all the aspects to that. Now, we'll talk about COVID as well, because COVID comes into this in two contexts. It comes in an indoctrinating kind of context, and it comes in terms of the actual damage to the brain due to the spike protein. So, and you can acquire the spike protein either by getting COVID itself or through the mRNA vaccine. So that's not great, right? So either way, you're going to get it. And he also talks about other ways that you could minimize the impact of COVID, again, in terms of your health, your general health, and things like micronutrients that would improve your general health and make you, even if you were to acquire COVID, for example, or something else like a flu or anything, how you could actually be, your immune system would be stronger and it would have less of an impact on you. So he's into that as well. So you can see him here. He does talk about immunology as well. It's one of his kind of skill sets. And this book was a bestseller in Germany, which is kind of interesting. So I think that's kind of important. So I'll move on here. So this is the press release. It talks about it here, an accessible description of the neurobiological mechanisms in the brain and how you can use those to actually implement a kind of an indoctrination policy or a way of using those mechanisms to indoctrinate people. And they've been used historically, even before people would have known how to do this, perhaps not by fully understanding the mechanisms, but they would have known that if I do this to somebody, I'll be able to indoctrinate them. And, and that goes back decades. So he does say that there's ways we can resist this, obviously, in terms of improving our mental health, our physical health, and that's a way of offsetting the risk of indoctrination. So here's his definition, and I'll read it through because I think it's interesting to read it. The purpose of indoctrination is to implant an ideological narrative into people's brains, a new belief that allows no discussion and no contradiction, right? I think we're familiar with that. The goal is obedient, unthinking conformity. The means to this end is a controlled selection of information, intensive propaganda, as we see it every day on the mainstream media, and psychological manipulation, up to coercive measures and threats of punishment. And I'd kind of talk about something like the B Canalta policy is kind of bringing in threats there, because, you know, you're a bully now, you're not buying into this stuff, so you're a bully, so there's a threat coming into a child. And then the more skillful the mental manipulation, the more immune the implanted ideological thought system becomes to critical arguments and inner doubts. So it's overriding the person's own critical thinking ability and their ability to engage in debate and maybe question, you know, is this fully correct, or do I need to look at this in different ways? No, that's ruled out. Try to get rid of all that.
If we look at the psychological
Yep.
manipulation that the Irish government did with McEntee pushing the hate speech law. Now, the hate speech law is still pending. It keeps getting kicked down the curb, but the hate crime law, putting in the 72 genders, and, you know, people thinking that if they say something online, or in England, we're seeing people get arrested for memes and get arrested for social media posts. It's that psychological manipulation and the threat of punishment. If you say something against the narrative or something we perceive as hate, you will be dragged through the process. So that, again, is an example of indoctrination, those hate speech laws to silence and censor us, but also the media labeling people. You know, someone who questions the narrative, be it on the open border crisis, the crime crisis, the transgenderism, the hate speech, the list goes on. They will quickly be labeled as a, you know, far right, terrorist, extremist, and labeled, and people have this psychological warfare going on, that they must believe the narrative or they will be labeled in a horrific way by the media and the government.
100%. It really is, and it has a chilling effect on people. And as I say, it causes people then not to think rationally about things. You know, I don't really want to think about that. I'm just going to go with the narrative. You know, I don't want to know, kind of thing. A lot of that going on in this country at the moment. So he has it here. The bottom line, he's saying indoctrination is to be understood as a vicious attack on your humanity, on your personality, and on your most precious thing, your freedom of thought. People are telling you how to think, like it's unreal. Like it's you know, so that's a huge intrusion. And unfortunately, this is happening in our education system right now, which is, I guess, where a lot of the concern would be. So let's move on. So I'll skip through the table of contents pretty quickly. This is just to kind of give you a kind of an idea. And he talks about the whole thing, the whole great reset stuff, the things that we've been seeing coming through the world of stakeholder capitalism. If you're watching this and you haven't a clue what that is, well, then look up the World Economic Forum and do a search for stakeholder capitalism. It's real, it exists. Companies are already bought into it. It's already happening, and it's having various effects on our society, unfortunately. He talks about people's ability to think for themselves, and that's so important. And he goes through the processes of thought. He divides it into two systems, the kind of system 1 and system 2.
Discovered with others that we have two thinking systems. He called one system System 1, which is the fast-acting system. I actually think it's not a thinking system. It's just reaction. It's unconscious, and it's a misnomer, in my opinion. Maybe good for the book he published, which says title Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. But the thinking fast is not really thinking. The thinking slow is thinking, but it requires energy. The energy actually resides in these new cells that are produced. And so and we need this energy to think and to memorize our thoughts. And I have even shown that this production of new neural cells is required, that we can actually remember our own thoughts. They are the mental energy required for deep thinking, for alternatives thinking, for thinking at all. So if you cut down the production of these nerve cells by creating neuroinflammation, then you not only have brain fog, which is one of the outcomes, which are now known as long COVID, post-COVID, or post-vac, which are all called spikopathy. But a spikopathy essentially is an activation of the microglia with the result that the hippocampus is harmed. And then we harm not only our memory center, or the ability to memorize things. What we also essentially harm is our ability to think, our ability to be curious. We reduce our psychological resilience. And we see the result we see in 21, for example, there was an analysis from the German Alzheimer's Society, and they compared the numbers from 2018 to 2021, the cases of new cases of Alzheimer's in Germany, and we had a rise by 31%. And this rise was not only, of course, that we have more cases in the age group 65 plus, which is natural, or not natural, but the normal time it takes for Alzheimer's to develop, because these measures and the spike protein are so harmful and causing the neuroinflammation, we have also an acceleration of the disease process. So the first time we had of these almost 430,000 new cases in 21 in Germany, 100,000 of those were below the age of 65, clearly showing that not age is the cause, but what was done to the population.
We heard from someone in the third level academia that college, university students going through the system now actually struggle to think for themselves. When they're presented with a question that requires critical thinking, they freeze. They don't actually have that critical thinking. So that's already being witnessed by the third level educators in school here in Ireland.
And you can, there are means that you can use to break down a person's ability to do that, and that's what's covered in the book. So that's part of what's going on here, and you're basically tapping into the to the mechanisms of the brain to cause that effect, that you would suppress the critical thinking, the individual thought, and replace it with the more kind of autonomous response, based on the narrative that's been imprinted on the person. And so long as they stay with that, that's going to keep their stress level low. So they're never going to go on the other side of critical thinking and thinking their own things, because that increases their stress. They're not able to do it. They don't have the brain capacity to do it anymore. And that's kind of what we're creating, is people like that. That's not a healthy person. Reprogramming the brain, he talks about it here, the assault on the human soul. So, the core, your ability, your core thinking ability is part of you as your soul, as it were, as you might think. So, and so he talks about that, the index neurons, I referenced that, and how you can overwrite. So you can actually overwrite them. This is the notion of brainwashing, the Chinese notion of wash brain, where you actually wash out the previous notions that you had, and you replace them with a new narrative. And he talks about this thing, the destruction of the autobiographical memory, which is essentially what that is. And fear eats the soul. So what he's talking about there is the effect of trauma and stress, and how it affects your hippocampus and can actually destroy your ability to create new nerves, neurological nerves in your brain that you can use. And then when you run out of those,
it even impacts more than the brain. If you think about people living in a very stressful situation where their adrenaline, their cortisol, all those negative things are pumping, it can actually cause illness. So not just the brain damage, but stress, anxiety, and fear actually cause the body to become very quickly go from ease to dis-ease. So what they're doing to children in school, indoctrinating them, is reprogramming their brains, which is hurting their brain development and all of the things you talked about there, but also making their bodies sick. And, Helen McEntee's coming out saying all these children have missed more than 20 days of school, and we must crack down on attendance, and creating all these different, technical things and policy to, track attendance. But why are children missing school? Because they're not happy, they're fearful, they're anxious, they're not learning, they're getting indoctrinated, and it's making them sick. So, of course, kids are going to miss school if you keep trying to brainwash them. But now let's create a tracker to crack down even harder. That will fix the problem.
Yeah. Now, he doesn't get into the whole area of things like mobile phones. There are other books, actually good books that cover that. We might put some links to those in the description. But that is an impact as well. Social media aspect, which is a source of stress, it's a source of bullying online, etc. So those are other factors for younger children in particular. It affects everyone, but particularly younger children. So he doesn't really get into that side of it. He does talk about the COVID measures and the impact they were having on people.
And it was already known from SARS-CoV-1, the virus which tried to make a pandemic in 2002 and 2003, and papers were published then 3 or 4 years later. They showed that the spike protein is quite able to cause inflammation of the brain, neuroinflammation, and that this neuroinflammation causes our autobiographical memory to shrink. And that, of course, is not a good thing. So the measures in 2020 advanced the shrinkage of our autobiographical memory center, and then it was even further advanced by the spike protein that was now not only delivered by the virus, but also by this mRNA program.
I'll post a link in the description, Eugene. There was an expert that came out and said that there were toddlers being tested with these protein flaps in their brains, which is like prions in the brain, which is mad cow disease, dementia. And they're finding these in toddlers where they've never seen them before. So we can post that link as well. This came out last week, and they do believe it's directly linked to the COVID injection in children causing this prion. So between that and between the indoctrination in school, God help these children.
System 2 is what you want to preserve, because that's your critical thinking. That's your soul. That's you being able to discern things and to be able to make up your own mind on things. That's why that's so important. And that relies on your hippocampus and the health of your hippocampus. And unfortunately, when you give stress to people and you put them, expose them to trauma, and that could also be pre-traumatic. So the thought of pending doom, like a climate catastrophe, for example, is enough to cause the same effect as if the thing actually happened itself. So by telling children these things and putting the fear of God into them because of the climate catastrophe, or because of world hunger, or intrinsic homophobia, or whatever it is, racism, and all this sort of stuff.
Or telling them they might be in the wrong body. I mean, a little 5-year-old child, all they know about life is they're either a boy or a girl. They have a mom, dad, and a brother, sister. That's all they know at that age, for sure. And you take away their identity that they're a boy or a girl, and that would be traumatic in itself.
Yeah, that takes the floor away from them. And what happens is you can't learn. That's what happens. Your hippocampus is no longer going to. There's a whole regeneration process that's needed in the hippocampus, and that stops when you apply that level of stress. So you can no longer learn anymore. You're not learning anymore. You're only you're reacting emotionally. And that's not healthy, right? Particularly for a developing child that needs to be learning things, that's a huge issue. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the pedagogy stuff here for a minute. I'm going to step out to what happens in education. This critical pedagogy thing, right, basically brings stress into the classroom. It problematizes things in the classroom. They call it that. They call it problematizing education. That's a term that's used, this so-called transformative education of Paulo Freire. So it brings in this stuff into the classroom where the child should be learning their English or their math, and you're bringing in issues of social justice and racial justice and climate change and gender into the classroom as generative themes, and having discussions on them in the middle of a maths class or an English class.
And the irony, Eugene, that this is all coming in under social, personal health, and well-being. So to damage their brains, brainwash them, overwhelm them, and cause stress. But it's under the well-being classes at school. You couldn't make it up.
Yeah. Well, critical pedagogy could be in every class as well. And I want to give you an example. Again, this is activist pedagogy, and I call it weaponizing education. This guy, Kevin Kumashiro, he's a queer educator, right? He's into the whole area of queer pedagogy, as they would call it. And here it is. This is from his book, his 2009 book. 2009, right? Against Common Sense, Teaching and Learning Towards Social Justice, right? And I quote, "Our children are experiencing the queer. Specifically, our children are experiencing the queer because they have been purposely placed in a state of psychological crisis." For God's sake, you hear what he's saying? Crisis, he says, should be expected in the process of learning by both the student and the teacher. Like queer activism, queer teaching always works through crisis. The goal is to continue teaching and learning through crisis, to continue experiencing the queer. Now, so he's advocating for this, using critical theory and critical pedagogy and queer pedagogy to get children that they're oppressed, or that they're privileged, or that they're in the wrong body, or whatever it is. And then they need to take on, one of the ways of getting out of that crisis is to take on an oppressed identity, right? Or trans identity. And become an ally for the oppressed, right? Or a change agent for social transformation, just to use that language, right? So you can see what's going on here. This is indoctrination. And an element of stress is actually useful in learning. It does inspire learning, so that's correct. But when you overwhelm the child, particularly a young learner, right, and you overwhelm them with this stuff, the learning goes out the window. That's the problem. The core critical thinking is gone. They can't learn. They're not going to have the ability to actually learn properly. And all you're going to end up with is a dumbed down child who's going to have the mantra of whatever they were, was hammered into them from a social justice perspective or whatever it was.
Black Lives Matter!
Black Lives Matter! Make some noise if you think that trans rights are human rights.
People are dying. Children are starving. Families are fleeing their homes.
They won't have actually learned the subject matter that they should have learned. That's the issue. Okay. So that's kind of, I'm just bringing that in there because this is related to it. So he talks about optimizing the hippocampal health, and there's a few things that are really important to anybody in here, which is a purpose in life. People need a purpose in life. Continuous learning and development is part of that. So as you go through your stages of life, even though you may be retired or whatever, it's so important that you have a purpose and you're continuing to develop yourself. Exercise, high quality sleep, appropriate diet. Carbohydrates and sugars are deadly, unfortunately. They're deadly for the body and they're deadly for the brain. And then micronutrient deficiencies. And he talks about two of them in particular. One is vitamin D, which is huge. It's huge and it would have had a huge impact on COVID, but it was censored. The videos on vitamin D that came into YouTube at the time of COVID were censored because they were going against the vaccine mandate. It was crazy because it's proven since, like the data is there since. And vitamin D, for not just COVID, for anything, for any sort of, your immune system needs it and your brain needs it.
Yeah,
and then
there's a great supplement out there, Eugene, that one of my initiatives that I'm working on is naturalliving.ie, and I've partnered with NutriHealth 365, and they developed a supplement which has vitamin C, D, zinc, K, all of the things you need, because those aren't the things the doctors said that people needed during COVID, and everyone has a vitamin D deficiency, most likely here in Ireland. So NutriHealth 365 has all of those in one supplement, really high quality. And I've noticed a big difference since I started those a few months ago.
These are so important. And omega-3 fatty acids for the brain in particular, brain health, are essential. And the issue, of course, is that you used to get these in your food historically, used to be, but the problem is most of the food we get today is nutrient deficient. It's not like it was 20 years ago, unfortunately, unless you're growing it yourself and you're doing the right things with the soil and everything. So you have to supplement. You just have to. But this is far better than taking other nasty things, because these are natural. These are all natural substances at the end of the day, and you're just supplementing them. So this is really important. He has there'll be links in the description to his Substack. So he talks about vitamin D, the vital vitamin. See, we don't get the sun here. We just don't, right, in the Northern Hemisphere. And particularly for people of color, so people who've got dark skin, it's even worse for them, because if they're in the Northern Hemisphere, they're getting far less sun. They're getting less actual UV under their skin than we would get, and they could be seriously deficient in vitamin D. And hence, we saw that with COVID, where a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere, who, people of color, were actually getting sicker with COVID than Caucasian people. And that's because they were probably heavily deficient on vitamin D. Of course, nobody was talking about that at the time. They all just wanted to talk about vaccines. He's got this whole thing about Alzheimer's disease and about this is a paper, actually, an academic paper. We'll put the link to that as well. So really worthwhile, people who are interested in this, who may be getting to an age, or maybe they've got parents or grandparents, for example, of an age, and they want to look after them, offsetting the worst effects. And he basically says, if you do the right things, you should be able to offset the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. If you do the right things, the things, some of them already. Again, he talks about it here, the Alzheimer's puzzle. So this is really good. So this is the two systems he has, system 1 and system 2. He goes through these in detail. The system 1, which is the zombie mode, which is you just do the thing automatically, like when you learn to drive. You drive the car, and you're not even your higher level brain functioning. Your body will just drive the car for you automatically. It's stereotypical. It's learned repetitive behavior. And I guess the problem with this is that when people get indoctrinated, the indoctrinated narrative becomes a kind of a system 1 thing. And you lose your ability to do system 2. You lose the ability to do the conscious thought and to be able to reason and to critique something and debate it. You know, if somebody challenges you, for example, you can't debate it anymore. It's like it's just part of your system one. I can't even, I don't have the mental capacity to even enter into a debate anymore on it. Like, this is why it's impossible to talk to people that are heavily indoctrinated, as you any of us would know. They're just going to they're just going to roll out their usual messages. They'll call you the names that they've been taught. You know, you're a bigot, you're hateful, you're transphobe. They'll just come out with all the stuff they've been indoctrinated with. And there's no sort of engagement. It doesn't matter whether there's a CAS report or there's some other piece of information. That's irrelevant. They don't have the mental capacity to absorb it.
I've tried to debate with people who, you know, they still watch RTE, BBC. They believe that, you know, believe it like the gospel. And I've tried to debate with people. And this is people who, you know, I would have been close friends with, even family members, even under my own roof, and trying to debate topics and present evidence. And when the evidence is presented and you have a really credible argument on a topic, it's just simply just resort to calling names. Oh, that's a conspiracy. Well, how is that a conspiracy? So here's the evidence. Here's the actual school book. Tell me how it's a conspiracy. Oh, down the rabbit hole, down the rabbit hole. And just simply dismissing things, but without being able to use their own critical thinking to have a credible debate. So I'm seeing the last 5 years, people who were sucked into the RTE and the indoctrination of the media, they lack the ability to have a critical just thinking discussion or debate on many topics. I'm seeing it firsthand, and it's really, really scary. These are people who were book smart, people who have good jobs, people who have degrees, and you're like, you can't simply talk about a topic with evidence. It's just name calling and repeating what RTE says. It's just, it's really astonishing.
We isolated all the measures that have taken place 2020, the fear mongering that continues in all areas, being it climate change, being it world war, maybe by fights over certain borders, which are currently ongoing on several places on the earth. And of course, the World Economic Forum, which talks about perma-pandemics. And so what is happening there? If you don't produce new cells in the hippocampus, which I call index neurons, because they memorize where and when we essentially had a thought, where and when we in our lives we had an experience that we wanted to remember. And these neurons are required to recall this memory. And if these cells are not produced, then of course we cannot memorize new things unless you actually override pre-existing memories. And now if the spike, for example, the neuroinflammation causes the hippocampus to stop producing new index neurons, and you at the same time, you have this fear mongering and the narratives pounding on your head, essentially, and force you to memorize all these things, despite the fact that you actually have no memory capacity, then you override previous experiences. That it means you diminish the amount of personal experiences, and your individuality essentially shrinks. You lose your personality, your individuality, and it is essentially overridden and by the narratives. And what you get out of this, you can imagine. You have people that have a reduced personality, a reduced individuality, and when they think about themselves, they only think about the narratives as being part of them. And I have encountered this even personally. I have family members who really believed everything that they were told, and there was no ability, no possibility for me to discuss anything with them, because the narrative had become already part of their personality. And so it's not a neutral discussion about any topics, about the science behind it or anything else. It is the very moment these narratives become part of their personality, everything changes. It's impossible, because when you discuss the narrative, then you essentially put their personality into question. And of course, that's what the people don't like.
Continually getting the same messaging all the time through the mainstream media, you never have an alternative, and then you become unwilling and unable to engage in an alternative discussion. You know.
Yeah.
So there's a video here. You can see it. So this is if you want to listen to him talking, actually, he goes through some of the material on this particular video. So well worth looking at that. And as I said, we will put all the links to anything I've referenced here, his papers, his Substack. He has a website, and obviously a link to the book you can get on Amazon as a book or as an audiobook. And I think it's really well worthwhile. It covers multiple bases, I think, Jana. The indoctrination is one aspect of it.
Yeah.
What happened to people with COVID and the spike protein, for example, and the real effect of that. The whole area of dementia and your mental health in general and maintaining that. And you know, once you have a healthy brain, like keeping a healthy brain is also a cure for indoctrination, because the healthier you keep your brain, the more open, the more you'll be able to engage, the more you'll be able to think critically about things and not be stuck in a rut, so to speak, operating in zombie mode, which is kind of what happens to a lot of people. They get stuck in that mode and they literally can't get out of it. They just
It's
can't.
hard.
Like
It's really hard for people to get out, and it's really hard for people to go back to using critical thinking when their brains have been damaged to the level by this programming. And you think about that's at an adult level. That's with adults that we interact with. Think about those 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old children in a classroom going through this severe indoctrination. And you know, you think about those innocent children, this damage will be irreversible if we don't stop it. So there will be another campaign coming. We have a lengthy letter we'll be sending to all of the TDs, the senators, the Minister for Education, Helen McEntee, asking for this to be stopped. We're also asking for a meeting with some of the independent TDs who we think we will address this, to really protect the children in Ireland. But it's also letting parents know what's happening. And there's a reason, as I said, that these books are locked up in the classroom. The parents don't buy the books. The government bought the books. They're locked away. There's secrecy packs. So every parent out there needs to see what's in the children's school books and understand the harm happening to the children. You know, turning a blind eye isn't going to protect your child, and worrying about the labels you might get for speaking up isn't going to protect your child. You need to know what's happening and stand up and advocate for your child before the damage is too severe and too irreversible. So I think that's a good place to end, Eugene. We'll post all the links in the description field for people to see for themselves, and also be sure to look at our recent content, which is the deep dive into the book Louder Than Words, and we've done also our series, which we did re-record and make it a little shorter for busy parents, the corruption of education, to do a deep dive on where this has come from, and it's decades and centuries in the making. So I'll see you all soon on our next podcast.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.